The RTX 3060 will long go down as one of Nvidia's most successful GPUs ever. With fast rasterization performance at the time, entry-level support for DLSS and ray tracing that we just hadn't seen before, and a great 12 gigs of VRAM that even to this day makes a lot of sense, it's a card that was popular for lots of great reasons. But for some reason it still remains one of the best-selling GPUs on Newegg, even in 2025, and I still get hundreds of comments every week from you guys saying, James, why not get a 3060 instead? Which is why I wanted to make today's video to beg you to please stop buying the RTX 3060, and why even with its 12GB video memory advantage, it makes no sense against the newer 4060 and 5060 options. Let's do this. The GeekaWhat Aorus Master 16 is here with a 240Hz 2560 by 1600 display, up to an RTX 5090 laptop GPU with a staggering 24 gigs of VRAM and Max-Q technology. The choice of CPU spans up to a Core Ultra 9 275HX2 with a turbo of up to 5.4 GHz and 24 cores for maximum power. What's more, there's also up to 64 gigs of RAM and room for a Gen 5 NVMe drive for the ultimate in storage speeds. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Now, I want to start by acknowledging how lots of the things about the 3060 are genuinely fantastic, and why if you've already got one of these cards, you don't need to go and cry in a corner and feel horrendous about your purchase. Nvidia got a lot right with the 3060, and has seemed to make a lot more mistakes since with the 4060 and 5060, which exhibit problems that the cheaper and older 3060 just doesn't have. You see, in many respects, the 3060 was a card ahead of its time. We're now in an era of gaming where VRAM is more important than ever, and decisions from Nvidia and AMD to release entry-level GPUs with just 8 gigs of video memory make little sense and are frankly kind of bewildering when you look at the current GPU landscape. It's for this reason that lots of people seem to get hung up about still buying the RTX 3060, and why on Newegg the 3060, specifically the MSI Ventus model, is still one of the best-selling cards. In fact, it's the 6th best-selling card on Newegg right now, behind only the RX 9060 XT, 5070, 9070, 9070 XT, and far more expensive 5070 Ti. Now, I've made lots of videos on the channel here about why VRAM is more and more important, and how in certain games like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle and the new Battlefield 6, VRAM can be completely fundamental to the gaming performance that you're going to achieve. And that got me thinking, how well does the 3060 compare to the 4060 and 5060? And to find out, I've tested all three of these cards against each other in a range of the most popular and most intensive titles at 1080 and 1440p. If anything, in the hope that it would back up my theory that the 3060 makes absolutely zero sense anymore, and also dissuade some of you guys from actually buying this card in 2025. Now, I'm going to start out at 1080p, where the 3060's VRAM is going to give it less of an advantage, and work through to the higher 1440p resolution, where in theory, according to some comments, this should come into its own. Now, starting off in Apex Legends at 1080p high, and we see here the RTX 3060 beat out decisively by the RTX 4060 and RTX 5060. In fact, Nvidia's newest RTX 5060 delivers around 280 frames per second on average, just 19 FPS away from Apex's 300 FPS in-game cap, while the last gen 4060 achieves 212 FPS. Both of these cards represent a sizable performance improvement on the 3060, which lands in with just 190. Now, I can see when you compare the 3060 against the 4060, how the 20 FPS here, just over 10%, might be enough of a trade-off for the extra VRAM. You might think, well, yes, a bit of frame rate loss in Apex, but that's going to be made up elsewhere, and it's worth the balance. So it's all about balance, right? We'll move up to Call of Duty's Black Ops 6, again at 1080p for now, and the RTX 3060 again falls similarly to the 4060, with 88 frames per second on average, compared to the 4060's 91.8. Again here, 3 or 4 frames per second, James, surely that's worth the VRAM. We'll move up to the newer RTX 5060, and here you're going to see 109 FPS on average. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, but James, the 5060 is more expensive than the 3060, especially on the used market. And you might kind of be right, but 3060 prices have remained stubborn. And if we want to bring price to performance into the equation, take a look at where the RX 9060 XT lands on this graph. Even the 8GB variant, which is arguably VRAM limited, is still going to pull in around about 160 FPS. That's compared compared to the 3060's 88. It's not quite double, but it's not a million miles away. Move up to Hogwarts Legacy at 1080p, and I'm afraid the 3060 finds no more an advantage. Again, it's still 1080p, but Hogwarts is one of the most VRAM intensive titles, so it should do well here. The 3060 here achieves 91.1 FPS, just 4 frames per second less than the RTX 4060, which pulls in 95.1, but the 5060 pulls in 126, and AMD's 9060 XT goes even further with 133 FPS on the 8GB variant. You can see how the VRAM can have a positive impact when you compare the 8 and 16GB 9060 XT with 156 FPS versus 133, and this shows you where memory can, but not always, be useful. You see, the 9060 XT is obviously hitting a memory bottleneck. The card is being restrained by the amount of memory, whereas on the RTX 3060, the card's being restrained by its own rasterization performance and not the VRAM element. In Cyberpunk 2077, without any DLSS or ray tracing, the RTX 3060 doesn't fare well either, with 82 frames per second compared to the 4060's 93 and RTX 5060's 121. Now, before I move on to the 1440p numbers, where we could see a bigger improvement from the 3060, I want to outline that I'm not giving the 3060 criticism for the fact it's outperformed by a 4060 and 5060. The gap between it and the 4060 being so small is a poor reflection of the 4060 rather than on the 3060, and I do expect a 2 generations and 4-year-old newer card to be faster. Of course I do. I'm more underlining that at 1080p to begin with, the lack of VRAM on the newer cards doesn't outright make them a worse option. But let's do 1440p, because this could change the outcome for the 3060. Well, starting off with Apex Legends, and we do see a different story. The 4060 is actually slower here than the 3060. 3060 put in 151 to the 4060's 146. But add Nvidia's newer RTX 5060 to the mix, and we see frame rates of around 210 FPS on average. Compared to the RTX 3060, this is around a 60 frames per second delta. This is between a 50 and 60 FPS delta on the average, which is enormous. And if anything shows that the video memory is holding the 5060 back in an enormous regard. Imagine how quick and how good this card could be if it had enough VRAM. In Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p high rasterization, a game we should remember is heavy on VRAM usage, the 3060 doesn't land well at all. It lands in at 63 frames per second on average, which is actually 0.1 FPS slower than the new RTX 5050, and is slower both than the RTX 4060 and considerably slower than the RTX 5060. The 5060 pulling in around about 85 frames per second to the 3060's 63. And this is at 1440p high settings. Move through into Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p high rasterization, and here the RTX 3060 pulls in 52 to the 4060's 56 and RTX 5060's 79. You could go a step further than this with the 9060 XT 8GB. Here you can see 84 frames per second, and on the 16GB 9060 XT, 88. Add ray tracing and upscaling into the mix via RT and DLSS, and the RTX 3060 achieves 38 FPS, the 4060 41, and the newer RTX 5060 sits even higher. All of this data then points to the fact that the RTX 3060 is just outmuscled by newer cards with newer technology, even though it has a VRAM advantage. Now you might be thinking, but does this change if we do more widespread ray tracing and DLSS testing? The answer is no, and if anything, that actually makes things worse for the 3060. A lot of the argument with the 3060 revolves around the video memory, and basically says that the newer cards are simply held back and bottlenecked by their higher VRAM amounts. Now that is true in some instances, as we've seen, where the RTX 3060 gets very close to the 4060 despite being a slower and cheaper GPU, and the only benefit being that it has more video memory. But add ray tracing into the mix, and we actually reduce reliance on VRAM further as the GPU core becomes more of a bottleneck and has to work harder. And add DLSS into the mix, and the newer RT and Tensor cores on the more updated 40 and 50 series architectures start to pay dividends. You have to remember how far the likes of DLSS and ray tracing have come since the 30 series first landed. We're now on what, like DLSS 4 multi-frame generation, where the 3060 has a much earlier version of this machine learning driven upscaling technology on board. I want to be really clear that this is not a slight on the 3060, and And in some used market conditions, it makes sense. But even then, there are surely better options. The 4060 has shown less price resilience in the used market due to its more negative reviews at launch, despite being a faster card than the 3060. And the RTX 5060 and 9060 XT are both very competitively priced. AMD's 8GB 9060 XT is far from perfect, but it's quicker than the 3060 in every possible scenario, and you can currently find it on or below its already competitive MSRP on the likes of Newegg and Amazon, and I'll leave latest pricing for accurate info in the description below. Really, the point of this video as well is also to demonstrate that VRAM isn't everything. VRAM is important, and please don't get it conflated. I wish Nvidia had put 10 or 12 gigs on the 4060 and 5060, and if they had, I think there'd be even better propositions than they are right now. And my reviews of these cards would have gone from maybe a little lukewarm to overwhelmingly positive. The 5060 in particular is a major victim of its lack of video memory, and could be so much more GPU if Nvidia had chucked another 2 or 4 gigabytes onto the design. But I want to put to bed a lot of the comments I get about the 3060. It's a great card, but its time has come and gone, and in 2020, 2021, or even 2022, it was a great option. But 5 years later, it just doesn't make the sense that it once did. What do you guys think? What are the best cards to buy right now on the budget end of the market? I know it's hard and the options can be difficult. Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.